So to give a bit of context, what happens at the moment often in teams is that they'll reach out to legal, and legal teams are often, especially in corporate, they're really overwhelmed. There's a huge amount of work across a really large variety that comes through those teams. So what's interesting is by deploying Wilson, which trains on your data, people get extremely fast responses based on their existing data that can then be triaged into the legal team if it's more complicated.
Welcome to another episode of the Chris, Rod, Max Show, where every week we discuss the latest news, developments, and what's happening in enterprise AI. And before we get started with our show of the day, with our guest today, I want to remind you to subscribe to our newsletter under chrisrodmax.com. And of course, to like, subscribe, and leave your comments under this video. So today I'm joined by Gus Neate. Gus is the CEO and co-founder of WilsonAI. Hi, Gus. Great to have you here today.
Hi, Rod. Thank you so much for having me on. Really looking forward to speaking.
So before we get started about what is WilsonAI or the space, maybe can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself? So how is it that you're building AI today? How come the problem? How come you're doing what you're doing today?
Yeah, of course, Rod. Thanks very much. So to give you a bit of context on myself, my background is that originally I actually studied engineering at Oxford. So I was technical by background. Most of my studies focused around a combination of information engineering systems and also actually entrepreneurship side was something I was really interested in there. But when I was towards the end of university, I actually entered an essay competition run by a firm called Clifford Chance, one of the largest law firms in Europe. And then off of the back of the essay competition, they offered me a place to join the firm. So I went through law school and actually became a lawyer, which is a very unusual route for an engineer. Having become a lawyer, I saw how many areas within legal practice there are that actually still have potential for automation. It's absolutely remarkable and happy to dive into a few more of those, but particularly obviously since the developments of large language models and the popularization of those, particularly the release of GPT 3.5 about 2 years ago, the amount that can be automated and done has really changed. So that's what sort of inspired the shift. In the long term, I think that there's a potential here for massively improved services within businesses and massively increases in the quality and speed of responses you can get when you have legal challenges.
Curiously, I know some profiles similar to yours of a technical background, engineers and so on, who decide to learn specialists in law, especially for the area of like patents, where it requires very in-depth technical knowledge. And then as a result, it's not just possible to be just like a pure-blooded lawyer, but one needs to have this technical background.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, actually. That one thing that I would say is actually sometimes software engineering and law, they're both super technical, very detail oriented, and actually very precise. So, a small change in language in both the contract or code can make a massive difference. So you do see that it can be the skills that you use in either engineering or law. They're often surprisingly similar, and very technical people looking for risks as well often. So yeah, I agree.
And if I go to the Wilson AI website, I see legal has never been so fast. Why is that? What is happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give a bit of context, what happens at the moment often in teams is that they'll reach out to legal, and legal teams are often, especially in corporate, they're really overwhelmed. There's a huge amount of work across a really large variety that comes through those teams. So what's interesting is by deploying Wilson, which trains on your data, people get extremely fast responses based on their existing data that can then be triaged into the legal team if it's more complicated. To be a bit more specific, we have an integration, for example, into Slack. So people would ask questions that they might normally direct to the legal team. Wilson can often then immediately answer those questions. So that takes 5 to 6 seconds usually to produce the answer. Whereas naturally, if your legal team is, say, even if it's up to 20 people in a large company, they'll often be in meetings or they're busy reviewing documents, running through those, that they can't break their flow state, which means that then your responses would be a much slower with a human process. To say you see the same thing across other workflows, things like reviewing contracts. So currently, or for many teams, and this is how I used to usually review contracts, I usually would be running through with a playbook, which would have all the key points that I needed to assess. And then I would manually go through, identify where they were, and then think very carefully and specifically about whether or not language needs to be changed, whether or not there are risks. For our tool, what it can do is it can automate that process. It will identify the risks, suggest the changes, and then lawyers jump in, and it's as if someone has already been through and done the first pass of the document. They just need to go and check through the outputs.
That example of contract review is something that I can identify myself, or when I was thinking, which situations do I have on in my day-to-day at an office, and then I need to request advice or assistance from a legal team. And then if salary is saying, for example, we want to start maybe a partnership with someone, we want maybe like buy a tool, and then we have this agreement. And the first question is, can we sign it? Does it have everything that we require? Is it correct, the contract? And then I will try to go and find someone who can help me. So if I'm in that situation and then I go to Wilson, what happens? How will it help me?
Exactly, you're completely right. So both for vendor contracts or partnership agreements, those can be put into Wilson. What you can do is you load the document directly into Wilson, and you can either use out of the box review playbook. So what that means is that would be using the positions that I've seen from my in-house background and that we've researched and tested at WilsonAI to review those specific documents. Then when you load the document into Wilson, it will run through and analyze every point in the document to see whether or not it's off market or doesn't align with the points that you need to review. Then you can get back. We do it with red, amber, and green flags. So if there are any red flag risks, we'll often see that would be a case where Rod, you would think, okay, this one I'm going to need to loop in legal on. But when you see a ton of green flags, you have a sense, oh wow, this is close to ready to sign, no major issues. Usually then you might route that to legal for their final approval to move towards signature. That process is done much more quickly when the first pass of reviewing the document can be automated using the AI.
And I imagine that especially at large organizations, there are so many requirements that are specific for these companies, so that one cannot, let's just say, take like a vanilla approach of saying, hey, this is like just common sense rules that we should be following, but rather should be very tailored to the company specifically. How does it happen? So for the tool, how is it functioning such that if I'm a very large corporate, I can really make it fine-tuned, tailored, bespoke for my own processes?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's two really big ways that we do that. The first of which is when companies already have existing playbooks in line, they can load those into Wilson, which will then overlay those on top of the standard playbooks to adjust them to your specific positions. Those are then still also editable by your legal team. So it's super fast to set up. You would load in your existing positions and then Wilson is set up. That's one piece around contract review playbooks. The other piece that's pretty exciting is we've just added a number of integrations with existing data systems. So people are storing documents in places like Google Drive or OneDrive, Confluence, Notion. Those can be instantly with one click integrated, and those pieces of information pulled into what we call Wilson's Superbrain. The Superbrain effectively is what the Wilson as the AI tool knows about your organization. When we do those one-click integrations, we then pull information from all around your organization straight into the knowledge base of Wilson, so that powers its outputs. The last bit to mention there is Wilson can help with highlighting where things are inconsistent or allowing you to then amend those policies. So Wilson might say it will give snippets and citations for where it found answers. And then they actually, sometimes we see teams using Wilson and find, oh, okay, it's given 2 citations here. I see we should be using our more up-to-date policy. They would then tweak that and say their Google Drive folder, and then that automatically powers Wilson next time for its reviews.
And for those who do not know, what is a playbook?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So sorry, it's a great point. Don't want to get too technical. So in terms of a playbook, what that usually is, it's a list of points in a contract. So things like indemnities, termination provisions, and then it's a list of positions that you would review for or risks, and then pick points you would go to. So it might be often like in a vendor contract, you would see termination and auto renewal. It's a classic point that legal teams will be looking at. They're often training sales teams, and that will then be flagged, the position identified, and whether or not that aligns with what your business risk level is and your commercial position that you want is. That's what people would flag as the lawyer for you to make sure you're getting the positions that are favorable to your business. Sometimes those sorts of positions, when it comes to an exit for a business down the line, are extremely important for how their revenue is valued.
I can well see how for those who require legal services at a large organization, they benefit from Wilson. But on the other side, if I'm thinking from the perspective of a lawyer, am I maybe at risk of being replaced? So can it be something where, so given that many of the tasks that I'm already doing, such as checking clauses, making sure that everything is correct and so on, are already automated and then therefore there is less work for me or no work at all left?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and it's a valid concern that you raised. But what we see this is actually that what we've often seen is that the lawyers we're working with are able to handle a lot more work and support more clients in the business to a higher level. The other piece that I do often see in legal teams is they're really swamped. So there are two big focuses. Often they want to be able to do more of the higher value, more strategic work, whether or not that's identifying risks and looking around corners in the business, joining and setting strategic direction alongside the business team. By taking a lot of the more low hanging fruit off their plate using AI, often they're freed up to do more of that. We're also seeing that the in-house legal team having more and more capacity, sometimes that allows them to get to contracts that might have gone externally because of capacity constraints. So it can be the case that people receive a large, high-value commercial contract, need it turned around within one day, but in their internal legal team, there isn't capacity. It might be the case that by using Wilson, you're freed up to do more of that work. Those are the two big ways that it's changing it. One thing that we are very conscious of and do a lot of with teams is instead of having jobs replaced, we also apply training. So we show people how they can do more and more work, and often that actually unlocks more things for them to do. I know there are lots of concerns around this with AI, but there were similar concerns around many technological innovations. And usually I think the way that this will pan out is much more efficient and higher quality services and actually more work being done overall.
We discussed the use case of contract renewal, vendor, so contracts and so on. What are the most common workflows or problems that so your customers are solving with Wilson?
Yeah, so I think if I put it into three big buckets, there's the bucket which is questions that come through their legal or operations team that are repetitive and that people feel that they're generally often stored inside an internal policy and they fundamentally are a distraction from the higher value work. Those are then automated with Wilson, and that's the first bucket. The second bucket is around reviewing contracts, and the two things here are flagging key risks and then actually marking up the documents, making changes to the language to ensure it aligns with what you need. Wilson is then used by teams for that. That's often more of a legal user, whereas the questions are more for commercial users. So often people all around the business coming from sales or marketing or the product teams to the legal team. And then the final bucket is something, it's quite an interesting one that I've seen a lot of in-house teams are focused on, is Wilson provides an oversight pane of everything going through the tool, all of the AI calls, but also all of the work being allocated within your legal team and metrics. We've seen a lot of teams that are struggling to get good metrics on what's going through the team. They want to understand, how many questions do I get around data privacy? How many questions are around HR? How many around commercial contracts? Should I be training people on this particular topic because we get tons of questions here? Or do we need more resources and to hire a new data privacy lawyer because there are this many queries or contracts coming through that are data processing agreements or data focused? We see both lawyers wanting more insight into that, and often C-suites are asking their lawyers to report on this. Wilson can often plug in and provide those metrics and the oversight that teams have been looking for a long time. That makes them a lot more risk compliant as well because they have better oversight into everything coming through the team.
Are there industries or a specific type of companies where you feel Wilson is the perfect tool for them?
Absolutely. So, I mean, most of our customers at the moment tend to be in technology companies. We've seen that the pain points that we're addressing are particularly acute in fast-growing companies. But actually, what's interesting is these problems tend to be prevalent across organizations of different sizes and across different industries. But at the moment, we tend to focus on working with technology companies.
For technology companies, one challenge I often see is rather more than, for example, asking if a contract is a valid one, rather the drafting one. So one is growing as you're describing, and then one, for example, wants to close a partnership with a large organization or maybe sell their software and so on. And especially if we talk about smaller organizations, they might not even have a lawyer in place. So can Wilson support companies that do not have in-house lawyers, or do I need to have already someone in the team responsible for legal?
It's an absolutely great question. So what's really interesting is we are seeing some teams. So one thing that Wilson can do is, and we have some partners that we work with here. So if you're a company that doesn't yet have an in-house legal team, it's possible to use Wilson as your first port of call to review a contract or to get questions. But Wilson does need to be supervised by a qualified lawyer in the relevant jurisdictions on the advice. The way that we're solving this is we're actually partnering with organizations. Sometimes those are fractional general counsels or fractional general counsel networks. And what that means is then you use Wilson. If you received a commercial contract, you don't have an in-house lawyer, and it's a larger scale contract than you're used to, you could run it through Wilson and get the initial advice. And if you want to turn that into legal advice, there are a partner of lawyers who can jump in and say, I'd review that contract for you. I'll pick it up from Wilson. I'll double check the output, and then I'll make sure that it's aligning with your positions. So that's how we see that working. But yes, we do see teams that haven't yet got a legal counsel interested in using Wilson yet.
So much confidential information is included in contracts. Also, of course, the documents required and so on. They can be, for example, the attachments. There is so many company secrets there. And there might be, for example, some concern, someone saying, hey, I need a tool, and then I don't know what happens. So how do you sort of like soothe those concerns for those who are fearful that here they're like revealing their company secrets to the outside world?
Absolutely. I mean, right from the beginning, we've had enterprise application in mind. So all customer data is kept separate and tethered to their individual organization. We're secured with an organization called Clerk, who are an amazing auth provider. And we also tie everything back to a specific organization, so nothing leaves that organization itself. No sensitive data is ever held on the client side and only our secured servers, and that's by design. On the model layer, one thing that's important is that we use the OpenAI Enterprise API, which means no data is trained or saved by OpenAI. Those are the main things that we've done to really allay those security concerns. But you're absolutely right. We hear this from legal all the time.
And can you describe us a common setup of like a company who has not yet adopted Wilson? What's their current status quo? What's their day-to-day? And then what happens after they have adopted a tool?
Absolutely, yeah. So generally what we would see in teams before Wilson is that they're often struggling to keep track and feeling like they're getting distracted and spending more time on items like repetitive questions or looking through tons and tons of vendor contracts or NDAs, and that's taking tons of their time. They're then like unclear on, is this something that's just our team? Like, how many of these contracts are we really doing? How much of my time is getting distracted when people keep pinging me on Slack with these questions? And how much of my time could I be freeing up? We then tend to see that once they deploy Wilson is handling a large proportion of the lower value work, but then they're also getting insights into exactly how much of that there is. So the way that they're planning and managing their team can be quite different. In the future, the way I see this working is that often legal will be a combination of AI agents and people. And really what Wilson is like an oversight layer through which you can orchestrate a combination of AI tools and the people in your organization.
Going back to your times as a lawyer, I'm wondering, what gave you the inspiration to start Wilson? So you were working as an engineer, so you already had like this technical proficiency, but why leave likely very comfortable job with a very specialized niche that I'm sure that is very well regarded? Lawyers are always like a prestigious role, a prestigious position to have, and then suddenly say, hey, I want to do a startup in the legal space.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I think there are two probably really big things. So one of which is that I was using AI tools and testing them on a range of flows that I was doing at work, and I was super interested to see the possibilities there. So it's interesting. I started using GPT early at 3.5. Clifford Chance also hosted a private instance, so I was able to use that. And you could see the quality of the outputs and the pace at which they were improving was extremely rapid. So that was an extremely interesting development, which gave me high conviction that in the long term, AI has enormous potential to assist in the legal space. I think it was the strong conviction that in the long term, there's massive potential. And then the other piece I was saying was there were tools like Cursor cropping up, which within software engineers has become ubiquitous. There is not so much the case for lawyers yet. There isn't really an equivalent. And I think there's an enormous potential to build systems that massively improve a legacy industry and improve the quality and pace of work. And you can see that that's happening on the AI side, but there's a big responsibility in being able to help people to adopt these tools. I think in industries like legal that are more traditional, it's super helpful to have a background where you understand the workflows and can talk to people through how to adopt these tools safely and to use them and where they're best placed to use them. I think that I was very lucky in that my background as a combination of engineering and having become a lawyer means that I'm fairly well placed to be able to help people to understand how to adopt the tools.
You are now bringing up Cursor, which for those who do not know it is basically a tool for software development in that traditional software developers, they will have some tools, some software, how they will program their own software. And with Cursor, they have a copilot that speeds up this process. So the idea is that Wilson becomes this copilot not only for users of legal services in-house, but also for the lawyers themselves that speed up their work, get along with their day-to-day tasks.
Yeah, so absolutely right. So at the moment, the way we do focus on in-house corporate legal teams, but Wilson, so what I mean there is that similar to Cursor, I think it's really changed on a day-to-day basis. If you're interacting with software engineering, people would really find it it's like night and day. People are saying, it's 10 times as much code I can produce. Legal, it's not yet the case that people are of the view that they're doing 10 times as much work with AI tools. But I think that Wilson will enable that, and that's what we're building.
You're mentioning also a GPT 3.5 Turbo and so on. So it does sounds that you are a trailblazer in the space. And I'm wondering, what's the current situation for lawyers? How are they currently using AI in general? Are they already adopting it, or they have not even heard of ChatGPT? What is it that you're seeing in the space?
I think what we're seeing, which is really interesting, is that there have been several waves of legal tech innovation, often hailed as going to be revolutionary, and I think that's happened several times. So within lawyers, and quite fairly, there can be a bit of sort of fatigue around. I've been told before that natural language processing was going to completely revolutionize how I work. What's really interesting is we're starting to see teams are using more and more tools that play with them, and at this time, I think they're finding that it is different. It's changing their workflows, and it's really saving them time. So a lot of the teams that I'm talking to are looking at tools more and more and finding that actually the level of time savings has increased very rapidly in the last year or two versus what was previously available. And so there's a ton of interest. What's interesting is you sometimes see people who have tried a tool, and then that's inspired them to understand what might be possible elsewhere in their organization. It's the same. So similarly, if they see their software engineers deploying tools, or if they see their infosec teams using tools, often the lawyers are thinking, actually, we should be checking out these too, because I think this might be really valuable for our business.
And I'm quite curious about that part because I know a few lawyers, and then my impression is that this is more like an offline, so to say, profession, such that, for example, if they have a document, they will rather print it and maybe highlight it with markers and so on. It will be rather working with Microsoft Word, sending emails. So let's say not exactly very technological, sophisticated. And then you come here with a very advanced AI tool. Is it difficult to explain it? Is it difficult so that users, the lawyers understand what's Wilson about and then to embrace it?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. So I think that's how the traditional side of the industry works. The way that we focus on this and I think about it is really about UX. So it's about making the tool extremely intuitive and building with really very specifically to the legal use cases and making it very easy to adopt. One way that we would do that is we go directly to the tools that they're already using. So for example, whether or not that's like inside Slack or inside email, if that's where you're used to seeing your outputs, Wilson will output into those tools. So it's very similar. A lot of people are used to having someone in their team assist with this work. So Wilson can often give the response as if it's a junior member of the team. That really can help with people that haven't adopted and used these tools before. A combination of making fantastic UX and the fact that we're seeing people really interested and excited about trying these tools, I think has massively increased adoption.
Right now, you have this integration with Slack. So the primarily touch point how users interface with Wilson, as I understand it, is through Slack. However, in large organizations, they use, for example, Microsoft Teams, or they might not really have a messenger. Maybe there is something in-house. What happens in those cases? Can you still support them?
Yeah, we can support them. So we support them through the web app. So the people can interface through Wilson, both through our website and the web app, and also through Slack. And they both sync together. So when you integrate together, anything asked in Slack also populates into the web app, into the oversight pane that I was talking about. In terms of the more traditional tech stacks, things like Teams and email, we're actively working on putting out those integrations too, so that this can be deployed across an organization with any tech stack.
And thinking about how you are approaching the enterprise, how you are having so your sales process. What has been some realization that you had along? Is there something that you notice? Hey, was actually a request that people had that we really didn't think about, or the other way around, something that you came and people say, "Oh wow, we didn't know that we need this. Now we need to start using it."
I guess a couple of things. So I think security is, of course, one of the big ones here, as in, using enterprise security, building with that right at the core has always been key. And that's definitely reinforced by our conversations with our customers. It's really important to make sure to keep their data segregated and secure, and to make sure that the foundational models aren't trained on their data. At the other, sort of maybe a slightly more fun one is we've seen interesting usage patterns sometimes. So we've sometimes seen that people can ask questions to Wilson, like I mentioned, either in Slack in like a public channel, or they can ask more privately through direct messaging Wilson or through the web app. One thing we have seen, which I think is a really interesting discovery, is that sometimes people will ask Wilson questions that they might have thought were like silly or were reluctant to ask, and they like to be able to ask privately. We hadn't anticipated that would be the case. But people do like to be able to ask something that's not like always in the public channel, that the lawyers still can have oversight over and jump in on. But that was an interesting piece that we also saw, was sometimes this is opening up opportunities for people that are unsure on where to get their legal advice to ask in a kind of more secluded setting.
Mentioning this of like the wider range of use cases that one can cover and also all the different areas that legal touches, I was wondering here that one, of course, of the challenge with generative AI is that there is always a risk of so hallucinations of AI making up answers. And then here with legal, one is, let's say, to stand on a secure ground on having the certainty that whatever the system is saying is really correct, such that I can make a decision based on that. Are there mechanisms that you have in place in order to maybe like deter, prevent, or like counter the risk of the eye making up something?
Absolutely, yeah. We're super focused and do a lot of testing around hallucinations. The two big pieces that we do here are every time Wilson gives an answer, it sources where it found that answer from, whether that's our internal knowledge bases or your ones. So often you would see, it's found it in this policy. Here's the snippet alongside its answer, and you can click straight through. It's similar to how you may have seen tools like Perplexity doing this. So generally, we found that trust in AI is usually heavily increased by making sure that you can see exact sources, and that also massively reduces the risk of hallucinations. We do a ton of testing around this. The other piece that we found here is that then we make the UX to be, so we think it's important that Wilson is not just correct in its answer, but what we would call is easily verifiably correct. So you can both see that the answer is correct, and then you can really quickly with the UX hover over and see where it got it from and that that's a trusted source. Or you can really easily escalate to a lawyer, have the lawyer looped in, agree that they're okay with that position, and then back to you. So a lot of what we're doing is building UX that allows AI outputs to be easily verified as accurate.
Now you were mentioning Perplexity, and for those who do not know, Perplexity is this browser search engine. So with AI that I can ask questions and then it will crawl the web and then provide me with a summary of the results. And when I think about legal processes, it's not only about existing contracts I want to review, but very often you were mentioning also like people having questions about maybe like their own personal legal situation. And there's a lot of like exploration for that, where, for example, I would ask, what will be current best practices for a vendor contract, or what are like clauses I want to have and so on. And then I would use a tool such as Perplexity and get these deep research reports with an outline of these best practices for contracts. With Wilson, is it also this possible? So not only have this discussion of existing process and contracts, but also exploration of things that I want to implement, carry out in the legal space?
Yeah, so the bucket that I would put perhaps what you're describing under is we think about that as often legal research. What we're doing at the moment is we're building out increased trusted data sets that people can use there so that you can do your legal research through Wilson. And we see teams, you're right, wanting to use AI for this. We also actually do a lot of this currently with customers. We speak with them and we do a lot of research, and using my legal background, I'm able to kind of give advice a bit around, what we're seeing in the market. I think that can be very helpful. But I think there's a lot of potential down the line for legal research. It's on our product roadmap, but it's not the core thing that we're focused on at the moment.
If we now you're mentioning so the topic of product roadmap and so the core focus, what would you say is the current roadmap and your focus?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we touched on it a bit earlier, but we're increasing the number of integrations. So I think you mentioned, for teams that are using Microsoft Teams or Word, we're building out those integrations. And then we're increasingly, Wilson already, for example, will completely answer questions or review contracts. We're now increasingly going further, deeper and deeper into workflows so that Wilson can go end to end. So those are the two big things is we're building more integrations at the moment. And then we're also making sure that Wilson will go all the way through a workflow. So whether or not that's integrating into, for example, sending documents out in DocuSign, or whether or not that's drafting approvals, emails, looping in additional stakeholders, those sorts of tasks. In the longer term product roadmap, there's quite a few pieces around the legal research which are in the pipeline as well.
Now you're mentioning also like drafts, and I was also thinking commonly how contracts and legal documents are written. This is not necessarily the language that we use in a day to day. And even for a native speaker that use this type of words, this vocabulary is uncommon. Does Wilson help me? For example, if I'm drafting a contract and I'm using common words, will tell me, hey, actually, this is not the correct term, replace it with this term that is the legal term.
Yeah, exactly right. So Wilson sits alongside you within, say, Google Docs if you're drafting a contract, and you can speak with Wilson. It's similar to other tools where you could similar to like things like Cursor, where you can be interrogating Wilson and say, "Oh, in this clause, I've written it this way. What do you think would be the language that an expert lawyer would use?" Wilson will then come back and clarify language and use the appropriate terms. It's worth mentioning that actually sort of more traditional legal language and legalese, in my view, the best drafting often is extremely simple and readable and legible for people. So it's, there's a big focus on making sure things are clear and easily understood.
Given the wide array of use cases and situations where Wilson can be implemented, I'm sure that there are other tools on the market that either are similar or cover some areas of what Wilson is so here offering. What is like the main sales argument or differentiator, this unique selling proposition that you have with your customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the top things that we're seeing with Wilson is that it sits as a first line of defense and actually a first port of call for commercial teams or the business teams. So one thing that's really interesting is Wilson's often in between legal and the business. And by in between, there's no barrier there. But what it's doing is picking up tasks and doing them extremely quickly directly for commercial users. That's one thing we've seen that we're very focused on that's a little different to other companies. So we consider a lot of our users would be a sales team that wants really fast responses to be able to go back to a customer either on a contract or a question, or it'd be someone who has a question around their employment contract and they want really fast responses to understand what what their entitlements are. Wilson is able to sit in that gap, so it's not just used by lawyers, and I think that's very different. The other thing that's quite different from what others are offering is this, sometimes we call it like a legal pane of glass. So what that means is, as a legal team, you're looking to get more oversight all across your business into what's occurring, what the risks are, and actually to be more data driven. What we've built there in terms of the dashboard, oversight, ability to automatically track everything that's happening, we haven't seen many tools on the market that are as good at keeping track across your team as what we have.
And you mentioned that your core focus is technology companies are growing fast. In the legal space, there are so many processes for technology companies that are, let's say, like routines, such as hiring an employee, a job contract, a termination letter, and so on.
Yeah.
And for this, I imagine that AI might not even require that. It's more about having the right templates that are maybe like reviewed by good lawyers and that are approved. Do you have a database of contracts that companies can browse through and say, hey, now I need employment contract and I need a draft for this?
Interesting. That's a great idea. So we don't have a current database through which people use. The way we usually would see this is people tend to take their template and then they will ask Wilson to populate that, for example, for employment contracts for them or make it specific. So the drafting tool, where Wilson will review and assist with amending contracts, can be used to tailor your existing templates. We don't currently provide templates of documents to people, but it's a really interesting idea.
And thinking about the technology space and just idea of legal ops and AI, which trends are you seeing in the space?
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing that legal ops, a lot of teams is becoming more and more core. I think over the last 4 to 5 years, it's interesting to see how early legal ops is a key hire for in-house legal teams. So often you might see even the second or third, people would often hire a general counsel as their first hire. And then after that, you can often be the second or third hire will be a legal ops manager, because setting up these systems and tools is a super useful way to get really, really high amounts of leverage from your legal team. So we often see very high ratios and increasing ratios because people are able to support more and more people around the business by using these tools. I think that's very interesting. So it's a big growth in legal operations as a sector, and as the importance of hiring that early and having those people in place.
You're in contact with many companies, and these companies maybe sometimes are not there in a position to have their first legal hire, about to make one. Do you have any advice for them? So what should they be looking today for a good legal hire?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple of the pieces that I would say are characteristics of a good legal hire, and this is often what you see from people moving in-house, is they really want to be close to the business and understand the business aims. I think that's extremely important. So when you're dealing with the sales team, it's all about thinking about what's the focus for the sales team here? What are they looking to try and get done? The same thing with the marketing team. So the best lawyers or the best legal operations and legal professionals are often really deeply ingrained into the business and trying to drive your core targets, whether or not, often that will be a revenue-based target or a sales-based target. And so what they're looking to do is to effectively manage your risk, but really, well, remembering that the key goals of the business tend to be around things like sales, driving more revenue. I think that that's something to look out for in hires. I would say the other key piece is really clear communication skills. Lawyers interface with the full range of the business. So that generally there's almost no area of a business that isn't touched by legal. So being able to have high EQ and great communication skills to deal with a big range of stakeholders is super important. So yeah.
The communication skills is, I would say, one is very interesting where, so from experience, often talking to lawyers, they might talk with a language that is harder to code, just the way that, so people struggle formulating their thoughts in some legal vocabulary, legal framework, then I see that often happens the other way around, that the lawyer might be talking in a way that for the layman is very, very difficult to understand what the person is actually saying. And one thing here I'm actually wondering, for example, could we imagine, let's say, like now that we have more and more conversational AI, that Wilson not only has functionality around contracts, but also, for example, around voice and discussions that are happening, and then helps maybe like to translate, so back and forth, so from very technical, very legalistic discussion in less like a common way to understand it, and the way around just a regular conversation, frame it in a legal setting?
I think that's really interesting and exciting. So we do obviously keep close tabs on multimodal AI, and we do things like hackathons where we try out these tools. I think really interesting to deploy Wilson via a voice agent, to be able to talk to Wilson and for Wilson to give really clear and easily understandable legal outputs. That's something that we are looking into and playing around with. But one thing that is interesting from what we've seen with teams is that the vast majority of communication with lawyers is usually written communication. So most people do contact their lawyers via sort of Slack or email or by sort of messaging them in text. And then most of the outputs that lawyers provide are written down. So it's exciting, but we haven't necessarily, it's not like our top focus, but I think it's a really interesting area.
Another thing is that, so with law, it is very country specific. And I imagine that, so you're having customers from all around the world. Can any company adopt Wilson, or are you only specialized in specific geographies?
So our two key markets that we're focused on at the moment are the US and the UK market. But it's worth mentioning that Wilson works across multiple languages and across multiple jurisdictions. The thing that we do recommend is, so Wilson acts like an AI paralegal. That means it's like a junior member of your team, but that you would want to supervise. So usually we would see where teams are using this in a jurisdiction. We would recommend that they have a jurisdiction, a lawyer qualified in that jurisdiction to review the outputs. That's the key piece there, but it does work across jurisdictions. One thing we have seen is that if a company has, teams across Europe as well as in the US and UK, then they will often have separate guidelines. So German data protection regulations is very different for American data protection regulation. So then the playbooks you can run things off, or the knowledge bases Wilson can run off, can be tailored specifically to that team. So that's how we've seen that being handled.
You were now mentioning the US, that is one of your markets. And in the US, so much is decided through core decisions. And very often this can be maybe like some obscure decisions that happen somewhere many years ago and so on. And then there are companies like LexisNexis and all these legal databases where people can find so what has been decided many decades ago. Can Wilson help there, either by interfacing with LexisNexis or by having already this knowledge base and then telling me, hey, actually, this was decided 2 decades ago and this was what happened?
Yeah, so often we'd see people have crib sheets of what they're using as their key cases, and Wilson would drive off those if for a large organization that they have that sort of information internally. Down the line, and in terms of what I talked about on the product roadmap for legal research, that's what would look like more of picking up these cases and interfacing with companies like LexisNexis or Thomson Reuters. That's sort of down the product roadmap for now. There.
Also, on the US market, and there are situations that very often lawyers will, for example, provide an advice, but it's never, let's say, like clear cut, given that it is litigated maybe through a court decision and so on. But they will say there is option A, there is option B, but then the decision maker has to decide, and there is not necessarily something that the person says, I will go into this direction. Can Wilson somehow like advise here in what will make more sense, or how can those who are exposed to making legal decisions but are not in the legal space be supported?
That's really interesting. So it's actually, I would say that Wilson's outputs would be quite similar to what you'd expect to see from lawyers, and we don't necessarily try and change that. So part of the reason lawyers are giving these options is that they want to set out the fact pattern, the risks, and the choices, and then it's often on the commercial or the sales teams or the marketing teams or product teams to make those decisions. But really, I would say these tools and providing options, that's the sort of output that we tend to see from Wilson. So if there are two paths, it would set out what you should be thinking about commercially, what the legal risks are, and then leaving the choice often does remain with the business users.
And I want to spend some time in so the other side of the business, on the lawyers themselves, those who are now adopting the technology. And we have among our audience, among our listeners, often those who are starting in their careers, maybe who are early career. And I'm wondering here, given that you've been a lawyer, now that you are providing tools for legal teams and the users who are interfacing with those legal teams, what do you suggest for those who decide, I want to be a lawyer, or I'm about to graduate and it's the year 2025, I see all this AI happening, I see that it's automating so many processes, what should I be doing to, so to say, future-proof my career?
Yeah, really, really interesting. I mean, I think the law remains a fantastic and extremely promising career path, and it's an extremely important part of society. And the rigorous training that you get as a lawyer really helps you to structure your thinking and to really understand businesses very well. I really enjoyed doing that at Clifford Chance, and I would recommend it to people. I think it was a fantastic experience. I think in the modern environment, the key thing that is different is I would definitely stay close to AI tools and practice using them. They're changing the profession, and we're seeing that people are using and adopting these. So being really close to those is very valued within organizations. Being able to, if you jump into both an in-house legal team or a law firm, being the person who really understands how these tools can be effective to the team and being the person who can drive adoption, that's extremely valuable as well.
So then future lawyers should not fear AI, but rather embrace it.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
And we have already covered quite some ground, but I'm sure that we're missing some things out, or some leaving some things. Is there anything that you would like to share with the audience that you find is important for them to know about Wilson?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's probably maybe a couple of things. I think two big pieces that I would say we'd love to cover is that sometimes there's we've seen from historic tools that there can be assumption that like using an AI tool could require a huge amount of training data or a huge amount of implementation. But actually what we're starting to see is that the newer tools, because they can work across unstructured data, they're able to be implemented and used a lot more quickly. So I think that that's a very exciting change that it's worth us flagging. So we often see customers saying, oh, it took me it's 12, 18 months to implement this contract lifecycle management system. What's interesting is that those processes can be massively brought down by the fact that Wilson can be trained across unstructured data and help you with structuring that. I think that's one like really interesting piece and a big development here is how much easier it is to get started with these tools than it used to be. And then I think the other piece that I would love to mention is I think sometimes people think about it as like AI versus humans, and it's quite binary. I think it's the way we view this is that AI really is going to augment how people are working and be able to support people in doing their jobs and enjoying them more. Many of the tasks that people are not enjoying in their job, whether or not that's, searching for a particular point, reviewing it repetitively, or answering the same question over and over again, those items will be picked up by the AI, which then actually means that those people are doing the strategic work of looking around a corner. I think that's very important. It's really AI with humans sort of hand in hand. I don't think that there's a sort of any gap there. Really, it's about augmentation.
I'm sure that after this conversation, there will be some who say, hey, I want to get started with Wilson. I want to give it a try. How can they do that? And what does the integration process look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can reach out through our website, www.getwilson.ai. And then the way that the integration process works is actually super simple. So it's a one-click integration, for example, to pull all your information in from Google Drive. You can select the documents after clicking that. The same thing applies for Notion or OneDrive. So it's very easy. You can drag and upload your documents. Usually this takes around 5 to 10 minutes to get it set up. And then you can deploy Wilson with one click into, say, a Slack channel or start asking questions through the web app. And it's super easy to get onboarded. So
for anyone who wants to get started, then go to getwilson.ai. But if someone has any question, if someone wants to get in touch, where can they find you, Gus?
Yeah, they can find me. So I'm available on LinkedIn, or my email is gus@getwilson.ai. Super happy to take any questions. I'm based between London and San Francisco, so I spend our early team is in London, so I'm here, and then I go to San Francisco every sort of 6 weeks or so. So either would love to meet up in person for a coffee to discuss more, or very happy to speak as well online, and they can book demos through our website again.
Great. Wow. Well, we covered so much about not only what is Wilson doing, but also the current situation with legal teams. What should early career lawyers should be doing in order to prepare themselves for the future of AI? And then where is Wilson headed? So there are some integrations, so many things that will be happening. I'm sure that for many in the audience, they'll be interested in reaching out, either to understand what's happening in the legal space or start adopting Wilson. So thank you so much for coming here today, Gus. It has been a fantastic discussion. And for everyone else, well, remember, leave us your comments. Let us know what you think about. Are you already adopting AI for legal? Are you afraid of AI for legal? What are your thoughts? And don't forget, join our newsletter on the chrisrodmax.com. Thank you so much, Gus.
Thanks very much, Rod. Really appreciate it. Cheers.